So what happens if I have video and I want to put masks on that and I want to animate that? Let's try that with the squirrel video. So I've imported that video and I'm going to drag it into the timeline. And I'm actually going to get rid of everything else for now. So I have footage of a squirrel in this case, and I want to mask out the squirrel so that I can put something else, so that I can basically get everything behind it to be transparent. I can do that with the pen tool. There are two ways of doing it. One is using keyframes, like we were doing before, and the other way of doing it is using a rotobrush, which I'm going to show you after. So the way that we were doing it before was that we were taking the pen tool, and cutting it out, and then going under mask, putting keyframes onto our mask path, moving to something a few frames later, adding another keyframe, and then going in and trying to modify our mask. And then maybe adding another keyframe later on. And going and modifying that. So that'll give us a mask that kind of, depending on how many keyframes you add and how strategically you add them, will kind of follow the shape that we're trying to cut out. So that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing this is using the rotobrush, which is right up here. So make sure we have our footage selected and click this. And what it does is it gives us a little green brush. And what we want to do is kind of draw, and it'll select the area that it thinks it wants. So we don't have to precisely follow the shape of our squirrel, but we do kind of want to suggest what it should pick up. So in this case, it's picked up too much because there's a lot going on in the background. If you press Alt, it'll give you a little red brush, and you can draw lines across what you don't need. So I just did that, and it took the background away. So that's sort of the general shape of my mask here. And there are actually these little icons down here that show you what's being masked out. So if you select this little red one, that's everything that you're cutting out, and this is the part that you're showing. And so that's sort of a really useful mode to work in. Now, to get to the next frame, what the rotobrush does is it works pretty much frame by frame. So you're going to have to scroll through them and keep modifying things in each frame. So to get to the next frame, press 2, and should show somewhere over here. So if you look at the timeline here, it'll show that I'm moving along my timeline. So if we keep pressing 2, you'll notice that things are starting to change. I'm not drawing anything new because it's still kind of highlighting the shape of the squirrel and it looks pretty much like what I want. But if I keep going, you'll notice that now it's not really highlighting what I want anymore in this particular frame. So I can draw a little bit more with my brush to get the shape that I want. And then I want to keep going and moving to the next frames. I can also press Option or Alt and erase a little bit of my mask if it's not accurate anymore. So I can keep doing that and adding to my mask and deleting from it when necessary. And you'll notice that it's generally trying to calculate it for me as I move frame by frame. So I just basically have to check that the shape in purple is still the mask that I want. And I guess this shows it even more clearly. So I'm missing something over here. I can also find my brushes. Where is that? So I'm just going to keep pressing 2 and scrolling through all my frames. If I press 1, it'll actually move back in time. So this mask that I'm applying can be found under Effects and then rotobrush. And it actually gives me a whole bunch of settings as well. So I can make it smoother. I can put in 4 instead of 2, and you'll notice that it tries to smooth out the shape of the mask. I can also apply a feather effect on my mask, which kind of fades out the edges into the background. And I can show you what I mean with another mask, or with this one. So once I'm done, once I'm done and I'm totally happy with my mask, I want to press freeze. Which will give me the mask that I have. And now if I go back to composition, you'll see that I have, let's go back in my timeline. You'll see that I have the squirrel cut out. So now I can go back to my project menu, take this and put something in the background. And we can also take our squirrel and we should be able to scale it. So we can move it around. We can. How do I? Which one? Oh, yeah. How do I get it to just like scale? Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we can scale it down to the appropriate size, and have the squirrel walk across the loft. Okay, so that's, oh, and I'll show you feathering as well, just to give you an idea of what it is. Like the rotobrush does it anyways, and most of the time when you use a mask, you want it to feather a little bit at the edges. So just to show you what I mean. Say that I'm drawing a mask on this layer, and say that so there's my mask again. I want it to subtract in this case, and right now the edges are really crisp, but if I set this to feather, see if you can see anything, or if I set it to, you'll see that the edges start to blur out. You'll see that the edges start to blur out on this image, so that's feathering. And that's really useful when you're working with something like the squirrel that has a pretty fuzzy shape anyways, or that's also really useful when you're working with putting people in an image when you're cutting out something from video that already has its own background. There's kind of no way for you to draw a mask so precisely, zooming in pixel by pixel, such that you would get the perfect shape. So it's nice to put a little bit of a feather on it so that it just blends into the background. Yes. So now that we have our video, it's important to save it. There's also a function called increment and save, which is pretty useful. What it does is that it's pretty useful if you have a hard drive with a lot of space. Because what it does is it will, depending on the increment that you set it to, I'm not actually going to save it on this computer, but what it does is it'll make a file called file001, and then if you kind of set it to, say, like half an hour increments or 15-minute increments. The next file that it'll save will be file 002, and so on. So you'll kind of get a whole bunch of files going back in time, which is nice if something crashes. So exporting, After Effects lets you export to Premiere, which is nice if you're working back and forth between the two. And it also, and if you're planning on working in Final Cut, you actually want to render your file. What's going on? Yeah. Do you remember? Yeah. So what we've got is our movie in the render queue, and we can look at the settings. We really just want our render settings to be identical to whatever we've set up our composition as. So in this case, it's 1920 or 1920 by 1080, and you want it to use the frame rate that we set up our file as, which is 24, and pretty much everything stays the same. And with our output settings, we want it to, you can output to different things, but in our case, you'll probably be outputting to, like you can output to Photoshop sequences and image sequences and all kinds of other things. But if you're making a movie that you're either going to take into Final Cut and work on more, or if this is your entire movie and you're done, you want that to be QuickTime. And output to lets you pick your file name and save it as that. So that's basically it. One other really useful thing that I found is if you're planning on working back and forth between After Effects and Photoshop, what you want to do first is make a composition that has the right settings for your video footage. And then, and it should let me do this. Okay. I'm just going to make an entirely new one. And then under Layer, go to New, and go to New Adobe Photoshop file. And I'll just save this as test file. And what that will do is it'll actually make a Photoshop file for you that already has all the right settings for your video file. So you can start working with this Photoshop file, which has the right dimensions and the right resolution and the right guidelines. Okay, so that's it for what I have.